Well, hello, Hudson, Ohio. What a nice turnout. I know she said warm welcome, but it is a little warm in here, isn't it? But that's what you get with beautiful weather, so I'll take it. I am just thrilled to be here. I will tell you that this was the very first book talk on my schedule. This got scheduled. The Hudson Library reached out even before my book was published and asked if I would come, and we said yes, and we set it for May 1st, which was a time right after the semester of classes ended for me. So it was a time when I could travel and be here on a weeknight. So I'm really thrilled to be here with you tonight. And what a beautiful town. I arrived here early this afternoon, so I had a chance to walk around a little bit and drive around. I went over to the Cuyahoga National Park. I love national parks. Wow, beautiful. Saw the Brandywine Falls. It was beautiful. That was great. Had a delicious dinner outside at the Three Palms. Had ordered the whole pizza, said I'd only have a slice or two, finished the whole thing. But it's delicious, so, you know, I was sort of sitting there, and what else could I do but enjoy the pizza? So thank you so much for inviting me here tonight and for coming out. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to meeting some of you in person afterwards at the reception. So I don't know how many of you have actually read my book, but thank you. See a few show of hands. But if not, I thought I would talk tonight a little bit about the book for like 20 minutes. And then I would love to answer your questions either about the book or disinformation in general, solutions, or anything else that is on your mind. I can even tell you what Rachel Maddow wears under the desk when she's, so anything really, anything at all that you want to ask is fair game if you've invited me to your town. So this book, Attack from Within, How Disinformation is Sabotaging America. People sometimes ask me, why did I write this book? And I wrote it because I have a background in national security. I spent the bulk of my career working as an assistant U.S. attorney handling national security cases in Detroit, and then later as the U.S. attorney. And during that time, I saw the threat to our national security evolve from first Al-Qaeda, and then to ISIS, and then to Russia and China and cyber intrusions. And I believe that now the greatest threat to our national security is disinformation coming from members of our own country, which is, hence the title, Attack from Within. I wanted to call it, the call is coming from inside the house, but they said that was taken. All those, those horror movies of the 70s, like Halloween with Jamie Lee Curtis, those are very formative years for me, the babysitting years. I can't even watch those anymore. But I do believe that disinformation is harming our democracy, public safety, national security, and the rule of law. And now I teach a course in national security at the University of Michigan Law School. And since about 2018, one of the assignments I have given my students for reading is portions of the Mueller report. And I think when most of us hear the Mueller report, we think about what he did or did not find about Donald Trump. But really, the report is mostly about Russia and about Russia's efforts to use disinformation as a weapon against us. And it talks about how disinformation was used to try to sow discord in society. And they did, and they have been wildly successful. I mean, if you wonder why is it that we're so mad at each other all the time, it is really because, I believe, of this deliberate effort to stoke anger and polarization, and to really push on these hot-button issues. Instead of focusing on issues where we have common interests, instead finding issues that are wedge issues in society, divisive issues like immigration and guns and LGBTQ rights, and really push those and amp up those issues so that we all become emotional and outraged and angry. It has been a wildly successful effort by any measure. And then the other thing, of course, that Russian disinformation tried to do was to influence the outcome of that election. And they did it a number of ways I'll talk about in a little bit with technology. And so I think that looking at that tool of disinformation, and now is being done through our own people. I think there are people who saw how successful that was, and now we have Americans using disinformation to obtain political power, make a profit Fox News and the Dominion voting disinformation, or their own personal career. I think all of these things incentivize people to use disinformation against all of us. And so the reason I wrote this book is so that it was intended to be a book accessible to ordinary people who can learn what I have seen in terms of disinformation tactics, learn about how they're used, why they work, so that we can all identify them and recognize them, and I hope defeat them and not be manipulated by them when they are sent to exploit us. So that's the reason for writing the book, and I hope you'll find it informative if and when you read it. The thesis of the book is that we are at a moment in our nation's history when disinformation is more acute than ever before. And we have certainly had moments in our nation's history with disinformation. We've had propaganda, we've had spin, we've had outright lies. But I think there are two phenomena that are going on right now that is making this moment so challenging. And one of those is technology. Social media makes it possible for anyone to send a message instantly to reach millions of people and to do so anonymously. That is a potent weapon in the hands of someone who is determined to mislead people with disinformation. And so I think that is one of the most powerful weapons. In that Mueller report, he talked about some of the accounts that they had identified that belonged to Russian operatives, the Internet Research Agency, and they used names that purported to be real American grassroots political activists, and they posed as members of various affinity groups. So, for example, there was one called Blacktivist that looked like a black political activist that said a lot of reasonable things. If you're a member of that group, sounded like modest suggestions designed to make our country a better and more just place. There was another called United Muslims of America, and they were on the left and the right. There was Tennessee GOP that looked like a grassroots group in Tennessee. There was Heart of Texas that looked like some conservative Texans. And they pushed all kinds of claims. And over many months, as they patiently accumulated followers, they had followings of hundreds of thousands of people. And then as the election got near, they started saying things more and more outrageous to stoke this kind of division in society and to influence the outcome of the election. Blacktivist, for example, posted messages that said, Hillary Clinton is taking our community for granted. What has Hillary Clinton ever done for our community? We should send her a message by staying home on Election Day. Now, if you are someone who followed that account, you were an African American, and you thought that Blacktivist was that same friend you've been following for months and months and saying all kinds of reasonable things, it might have caused you to pause and give some thought to it. And in fact, if even only a few people heeded that advice in swing states that were decided by a narrow margin, that could have made a difference in the outcome of an election. We'll never know. But that is the power of disinformation online, creating a false persona, pretending to be something you're not, and then agitating people and suggesting saying outrageous things so that opponents of that group will see it and say, look at these people. They're so unreasonable. They're demanding so many things. Heart of Texas started proposing the secession of the state of Texas with claims, and so did other social media outlets. And in fact, cessation of Texas ended up on the Republican platform in the state of Texas that election. Where did that idea even come from? People got the idea from these false accounts, and it snowballs and it picks up steam. Really crazy, but I think it really demonstrates the power of social media. So that's one issue. Then the other reason I think we are ripe for the picking is because our society is so polarized. I think some of that has been stoked by this Russian disinformation that is pushing on both sides of these wedge issues. But I also think it is the result of politicians, and here's where I don't like to always both sides, because sometimes both sides are not to blame. I think that there are members of the far-right extremists who are really pushing disinformation. But here is where I think both parties are to blame, and that is extreme polarization. Since the late 90s, it has been the strategy of both political parties to do something very different from what they had done before that. Before that, when I was growing up, the way the parties came together before an election was to try to court voters who were moderates, right? Find the persuadable middle the swing voter. That's where I'm going to win my election. And so I might tack far to the left or right in the primary, but I'm going to come back to the middle for the general because I want to attract those middle-of-the-road moderates, which is most of society. And I want those voters. Instead, Karl Rove, who was working for George W. Bush at the time, came up with a strategy that was so successful that the other party has now replicated it. And that is, you don't go for the middle, you double down on your base. And that's because what you really need is for your base to turn out. Because if your base turns out in high numbers, they are reliably in your column. Those are the people you want to come to the polls. So how do you get them to come to the polls? By convincing them that this election is an existential race between good and evil. And those are the only two choices on the ballots, and you must vote, you must show up. And so, you know, that leads to all this campaigning that generates outrage and anger and fear. And so I think those two things, this polarization and the technology that can trick us, is causing us to be in this moment of great disinformation. And so that is a problem. I think that some of the harms that we are seeing are really concerning right now, and especially concerning if left unchecked. So first, I think that disinformation is harming our democracy. I think that we can expect that as the 2024 election comes near, we are going to see disinformation just as we did in 2020, 2022, 2016. And this time, we've got artificial intelligence to add to the mix. So, you know, typically disinformation for voting comes in three varieties. One is influencing which candidate you'll choose. Another is in dampening voter turnout, making it hard to know what the rules are. And then the other is undermining confidence in the outcome itself. And I think we are going to see disinformation in all three categories. But all of those make it harder for us to choose the candidates of our will. You know, these influence campaigns like the ones I just talked about with Blacktivist and Heart of Texas, that's one way. Dampening turnout, I think, is something I'm particularly worried about in 2024 with artificial intelligence. You may have read or even listened to the recording of Joe Biden that was used in New Hampshire, generated by artificial intelligence. Sounds just like Joe Biden. I listened to it, complete with references to malarkey and all of it, and urging voters to stay home on Election Day in the New Hampshire primary. Don't waste your vote, save it for the fall, which of course makes no sense whatsoever, right? You can vote in both. But it sounded pretty good, and you could imagine some voters hearing that and believing it and wanting to follow that advice. So what more will we expect before the general election? What if people get a call on Election Day and say, the power is out at your polling place, you should come vote on Wednesday, right? And then by the time you show up on Wednesday, they say, what are you talking about? It's too late. The election was yesterday. I could imagine those kinds of things harming our democracy. I believe that disinformation is also harming public safety and national security. We are seeing threats up like never before, threats against all kinds of public officials, people who work in public health over COVID-19 masking, people who work in election boards, who, people who don't like the outcome, accusing people of cheating or of fraud, for people who are just doing their job and trying to administer elections fairly. People at county clerk's offices, city clerk's offices, school boards. People say, who needs this? You know, it was already a pretty thankless job with long hours and little or no pay to do these jobs. So we are seeing a complete hemorrhaging of these jobs, of people who say, no thanks, I don't want to be the target or have my family be the target of these kinds of threats, or swatting, you know, where somebody calls the police department and says there's a barricaded gunman at the home of this person, and they show up with the tanks and other kinds of things, which can create a very dangerous situation. There was even a fatality in one of these swatting incidents in 2015. And so that kind of thing is really harming public safety. It's harming our national security. On the world stage, we have always been a leader in democracy. And since World War II, it has been the policy of the foreign policy of this country to lift up democracies around the world, because of the belief that when other countries have democratic forms of government, there are fewer wars, there are fewer refugee crises, and there are better and more trade partners for the United States. And so we've worked hard to lift up democracies around the world. But after January 6th, when people saw those images of hand-to-hand combat with Capitol police officers and the breaking of windows and sitting in the Senate chamber with their feet up on tables, people around the world saw those images. And Russian officials, one in particular, said, the United States is no longer the beacon for democracy in the world. American democracy is limping on both feet. See, this just proves that democracy doesn't work. In China, President Xi has said, this is evidence that democracy doesn't work. Democracy is not the answer. What you really want is prosperity, and a different form of government with a strong central leader is the way to prosperity. People can't agree on anything, and look, it comes to this if you have a democratic form of government. And so that harms our national security when we have democratic backsliding, because that means if we thought we'd have fewer wars, fewer refugees, and more trade partners with democracy, then without democracy, we're going to have more wars, more refugee crises, and fewer trade partners, which is something I think that we're seeing right now. And finally, I think that disinformation is harming the rule of law. The rule of law is the rule that says we can disagree about whatever it is we want to. We are a pluralistic society with all kinds of views, and that's okay. But we resolve our disputes at the ballot box or in a court of law. You file your lawsuit, you fight as vigorously as you can within the rules, and then you accept the outcome. And if you don't like the outcome, you work to change the law through lobbying or protest or letters to the editor or running for office yourself. There are a lot of ways to achieve change in society. But what we don't do is use brute force to reach the outcome that we want. And so when you see January 6th with people showing up at the Capitol, trying to use physical force, intimidation, in an effort to prevent the certification that will allow the peaceful transfer of presidential power, I mean, wow, that is a complete violation of the rule of law. I would say it's also a violation of the rule of law when you see it leads to vigilante violence, like the man who broke into Nancy Pelosi's home and beat her husband with a hammer, or the man who breached the FBI office down in Cincinnati after the search at Mar-a-Lago was so outraged by what Donald Trump had said that the FBI had planted evidence in his home. Of course, he later said he had every right to keep those documents, so consistency is not his forte. But this man who breached the FBI office in Cincinnati posted on social media, "Great patriots, we have to fight back. The FBI is the enemy." And when he tried to breach that office, he was chased off and later killed in a standoff with police. And so I think that disinformation is harming all of these aspects of society, which are the fundamental pillars of our society, those institutions that keep us safe and allow us to move forward as a country. But I am pleased to say it's not all doom and gloom. In my book, the longest chapter is one on solutions. And I think there are many solutions. I don't know that any one solution will solve this whole problem, but I think there are many solutions that can mitigate the problem. I believe that any problem created by humans like this one is one that can be solved by humans, like all of us, and I think we can. Sort of on the supply side of disinformation, I think there are a number of things that we can do, regulations that we can put in place for social media companies that would not in any way impact First Amendment rights or free speech rights. They are content neutral, but things like regulating the algorithms. We know from this Facebook whistleblower, Frances Haugen, that Facebook deliberately has algorithms, it's just computer programs that push to the top of our feeds content that is designed to outrage us. And so we see that, and the reason they do that is because they know from their data that the more outrageous content is, the longer we stay online because we have to respond to it, and we have to send it to our friends and say, "Can you believe this? This is so awful." But the longer we're on, the more we're seeing ads and the more they can charge advertisers. So it is profitable for Facebook to make us mad, and so that's what they do. Why can't we regulate those algorithms to prevent that, or at least disclose it so that we know when we're being manipulated? I think we could also regulate social media to prevent them from scraping our personal data and then selling it to data brokers who share it with commercial enterprises and political consultants. If you ever look on social media, you realize that we have shared an awful lot of information about ourselves by the things that we like and share and that we click on. They know us better than we know ourselves. These days, I keep getting bombarded by ads to buy a Detroit Tigers baseball cap. Yes, I would like to buy one. How do you know? They know us so well. They hit me up with all kinds of references to the 1984 world champion Tigers. Remember when? Yes, I do. Those were such great days. They know what I'm a sucker for. But they're gathering all that data, and that's what's used to micro-target us and send us things that we see that they know are going to push our buttons politically as well, or the things that are going to stoke our anger and our outrage because they know us better than we know ourselves. And so I think we could have legislation that prevents the collection of that data, or at least an opt-in system. And in fact, there are a couple of bills going on in Congress right now that gives me a little bit of hope that this one might actually see the light of day. I also think that we could regulate the bots that are online, right? These are these AI-generated accounts that look like a real account. They might have a name like Patriot Girl with a photo of some flag or eagle or something. And it turns out it's just an artificial intelligence-created fake account. It's not a real person that's manning it. It has been programmed to argue with you. So if you talk about something in politics, you raise an issue relating to guns, they're going to come back and tell you that you're a radical leftist if you don't like guns, or if you favor gun rights, they're going to tell you that you're a baby killer, and they're just programmed to keep saying these things. So if you respond and you start replying to their messages back, at some point you may not know this, but you're simply arguing with software. So you might want to steer clear of arguing with people online who. One of my favorite New Yorker cartoons is the one, you ever see this one where it's an old one, two dogs are sitting, one's at a computer keyboard and the other one's next to him, and he says to his friend, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. And it's true, right? So there's Russians and there's bots, but I think we could eliminate these bots, because the other thing these bots do is they amplify the accounts that are spewing disinformation. So Blacktivist also sets up 1,000 bots, and every one of those bots is liking and sharing Blacktivist's posts, so it looks more popular than it is, and it reaches farther than it otherwise would. So I think those are some things that we can do. They're modest, realistic solutions that could reduce disinformation from the supply side. I also think there are things we could do from the demand side. One thing I think we could do is improve our own media literacy. In Finland, where they are neighbors to Russia and have been bombarded for decades with Russian disinformation, they have implemented in their schools media literacy courses for their students so that they can read things with a skeptical eye, right? They teach them things like look for a second source of information. Don't just believe the headline, actually read the story. Understanding the difference between causation and correlation. Looking at a data sample before you believe the results of some study, right? Was the data set 2 million or was it 2? Because that can make a big difference. So I think media literacy is something we should do. Civics education, I think, is something we need to restore in this country. I don't know about you, but I had civics education when I was in school. I learned a lot, right, about the 3 branches of government. I also am a child of the 70s, and so I also had Schoolhouse Rock. I don't know about any of you, right? I'm just a Bill sitting here on Capitol Hill. I still remember all of that. And that's an important part of civics education. But I have read that today we spend in this country an average of 5 cents on civic education for every $50 we spend on STEM education. Now, STEM education is important, and it probably requires equipment that is expensive, but 5 cents, we can do better than that. And I think we need to make sure we're teaching young people civics education so that they understand our institutions of government and how important these things are. But the final thing I'll say is there's something that all of us can do as well. And that is, I think that we need to model the way a member of society ought to behave in politics. And that is to think independently about issues. I think that today I see so many young people among my students who line up on the party line, whether they're on the left or the right, and it's almost as if they reverse engineer their own viewpoints to match what the party holds true, because they don't want to be labeled that other party, because they're bad. They've been told they're the enemy. They've been demonized. And so what does my group think? Oh, yeah, me too. Like, I don't know about you, but when I was in high school or college and first forming my views on certain things, I thought about each one of them independently, where I stood on guns versus abortion versus immigration versus, affirmative action. I thought about each of those independently. I might have been, probably mostly fairly moderate, but on some issues maybe a little more right, and some issues maybe a little more left. But I was kind of just thinking about the issue. And now our students are just lockstep with whatever is the party line, and that is because we've become so polarized. And now it seems that members of our parties care more about winning than they care about truth. And I think that while some people are genuinely fooled by disinformation, I think there are others who are not, and they don't care. When Elise Stefanik repeats Donald Trump's claims that the people who attacked the Capitol on January 6th and have been jailed for their conduct are hostages, I don't think she believes that for a minute, but I think she wants her team to win because that might make her vice president or advance her career in some ways. I think all of us probably align with one team or another in our politics, but I think that we have to demand truth from our politicians, from our leaders, and from each other. And so I ask you, when you see an issue, to think about it independently and have a conversation with people and not just line up according to the party lines. I think there are too many people willing to choose their tribe over truth, and I would ask you to do just the opposite and choose truth over tribe. Well, I'll stop there and take your questions.
All right, I'll just speak for everyone and say thank you so much for what a wonderful and engaging presentation and discussion. I think there was a lot to think about there. We do have some very interesting questions so far, so I do have some to read for you. First, I have from Shelley. Shelley has a question which she would like to ask if you could comment on SCOTUS' line of hypothetical questioning last week versus discussing the actual case.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, so great question. You know, there are a few, COVID was a horrible thing, but there have been a few good, like, silver linings to it, and one is the Supreme Court now live streams oral arguments, and so you can listen in real time, for better or for worse. That oral argument was very interesting, and you know, one of the things that happens in oral argument is to test the logic. There will be hypothetical questions that get asked. This happens in law school, it happens in courts, and the idea is we want to kind of think about, wow, if we make a decision in this case now, could it be used in some bad way in the future? And we want to make sure we're thinking this through in all of these ways. So it makes a lot of sense. But one of the things I heard said that day was, I'm not worried about this case. We're thinking about writing a decision for the ages. And you know, that was very concerning to me, because then they entertained all these hypotheticals, like about a coup and about an assassination. Like, would that be an official act? And the disturbing answer from Trump's lawyer was, well, that would depend. Like, what? You know, one of the tips I usually give to students and lawyers is, if you're in a hole, stop digging, right? You need to concede certain points to have any credibility whatsoever, and he did not concede that. He said it would depend. So it was very concerning to me that Justices Alito, Kavanaugh, Gorsuch really seemed to be going down this road of imagining all of these scenarios that could be permissible by a president, which is really shocking to me. But it comes back to me to the question that they asked the parties to brief. The court gets to decide. You know, people will appeal their case to the Supreme Court, and then the court might narrow the issue or reframe the issue to one that they think will be most useful to not only decide this case, but to decide cases in the future. And the question that they presented for both parties was, to what extent does a former president have immunity, if any, for official conduct committed while in office? And I think Jack Smith would say, well, that's fine, but my case is all about unofficial conduct. Nothing that President Trump is alleged to have done has anything to do with official conduct. I mean, it's about interfering with elections, which are the province of states. The president has no role in getting involved in state elections. And so it was a very curious way just to frame the question, but I think it is because Justice Gorsuch and others are thinking about for the ages. And I think it is a legitimate concern to make sure that we don't say presidents never have immunity, because I do think that there ought to be some immunity for certain acts committed in office, official acts that are reasonably within the best interest of the country, even if someone might disagree. You know, acts of war, acts of commander-in-chief that later could be second-guessed, dropping a bomb, dropping a drone, those kinds of things. But that's not this case. And so when they said, I'm not concerned about this case, I'm concerned about cases for the ages, it reminded me of a quote from another case by Chief Justice John Roberts, who once said, if it is not necessary to decide an issue to decide the case, it is necessary to not decide the issue when deciding the case. And so I hope someone reminds him of that in the near future. But I'll tell you, I'm actually a little bit cautiously optimistic that this might come out okay, in part because of Justice Amy Coney Barrett. I don't know who was listening, if anybody was listening to this, but man, she was on fire. It was as if she was taking a deposition, you know? She's got it like maybe we can get this resolved right here. So she asked the lawyer for Donald Trump, his name's John Sauer. Now, Mr. Sauer, the indictment alleges that Donald Trump pressured Brad Raffensperger in Georgia to find him 11,780 votes. Would you concede that that is a private act and not an official act? Yes, I would. Alrighty. And now the second paragraph says, you know, and she went on like that. She got a bunch of them. She got him to concede a bunch, like, well done. And then her time is up, and it goes over to Justice Kagan, and she says, picking up where Justice Barrett left off, would you also concede? And got a bunch more, which is great. But there were a few where he would not concede, and there were instances where, for example, it involved conversations between Donald Trump as president and Vice President Mike Pence in the Oval Office, or directives to the Department of Justice. Is that not official conduct? But the one thing, and so there's a worry that one outcome here might be to remand to the lower court to kind of parse through this and see what's official and what's unofficial. But Roberts, again, who also had some skepticism. He didn't like the decision of the Court of Appeals that he thought just kind of was very summarily found that there was no immunity here. But he did ask some questions about this and said, isn't it true that a president, bribery is not an official act, and if a president was charged with bribery, he could be convicted of that. That would be a crime. There would not be immunity for that. But what if it was bribery for some official act, like the appointment of an ambassador? And the lawyer for Trump said, well, no, that would be an official act. And he said, but isn't that a one-legged stool? If we have to talk about the bribe, we also have to talk about the appointment. That's just evidence. And so I think one way that this case could come out is with 5 votes, which is all you need, right? Kagan, Sotomayor, Jackson, Barrett, and Roberts, who say that maybe for the ages, there's going to be some different rule, but this case is all about unofficial conduct, even if there is some official conduct that's evidence. But the crimes charged, conspiracy to defraud the United States, obstruction of an official proceeding, conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding, violation against voting rights, none of those are official acts. And so I remain cautiously optimistic that they could actually decide this case before this term ends and get the case back on track for trial. Now, it requires kind of a perfect storm of everything lining up, so it's probably a long shot at this point, but it's still a possibility. I think eventually this case will be decided. I think eventually this case will be decided in favor of the special counsel. The only concern, of course, is that the decision doesn't come until 2025, at which point we will all be speaking Russian. No.
All right, we have another very interesting question from Glenn. So Glenn wants to know, in light of multiple attorneys facilitating false election claims, what are attorneys in training being taught regarding ethics and the situation in law school?
This is a great question. Who's Glenn? Where's Glenn? Good question. Thank you, Glenn. That's a very good question. Yes, I mean, so many lawyers have been either charged with crimes relating to all of this election interference or been disbarred or in the midst of disciplinary proceedings. I specifically remind my students of that all the time. Law students are required to take ethics, though that's been true for decades, and I guarantee you all of these lawyers also had courses on ethics. But what I tell my students, and I've prosecuted lawyers before who have gone astray with stealing client funds or being involved in criminal activities along with their clients, just remember that every one of these lawyers who's been charged with a crime or been disbarred once sat in a classroom just like this one, and they once listened to an ethics lecture. They once took an ethics exam, and they passed that ethics exam. And as they sat there, they thought, That's never going to be me. I know that's probably what you're thinking today. That's never going to be me. But you need to set for yourself what the boundaries are going to be in your own practice, because no case is worth your reputation. I used to tell lawyers who started in my office when I was the U.S. attorney and hiring brand new lawyers, and told them that your integrity is the most important thing you have. And remember, when you represent the United States of America, you have credibility you did not earn. And you can squander that credibility and ruin it for the rest of us who represent the United States of America. So no one case is worth it. If you ever have a case that you think you're losing, you've made a mistake, come see me. We will have your back. We will dismiss the case. And that's all we need to do. But I think that people, find these temptations, whether it's money or power or prestige. These people close in Trump's orbit clearly got really sucked into that vortex. There's sort of like the reverse Midas touch, right? The everything Midas touch turned to gold. It seems that when you are in the sphere of Donald Trump, it's kind of the opposite. And I think, he swears by the work of Roy Cohn, who was a lawyer who also represented Joseph McCarthy, and I think was a anything goes, ends justify the means, bare-knuckled lawyer, and that to me is the antithesis of the ethical lawyer. I'd like to think, and I do believe, that most lawyers are deeply ethical and appalled by this behavior. It's why that when these lawyers are going before their bar disciplinary proceedings, nobody's getting through. They're all getting disbarred. And I think there's a good reason for that. It's because they taint the whole profession. I think it's sort of like the way police officers probably feel when there's one of these awful police shootings or use of excessive force cases, that you're making us all look bad. We work really hard to do our jobs the right way, and it's hard to do your job the right way, but we know that that's the essence of the job. And so when you violate those rules, you besmirch the reputation of all of us. And so I think people in the profession may care even more deeply than the rest of society about upholding those standards.
We've received so many good questions tonight, but I do know time is running short because we do have to still do a book reception and signing that I'm sure everyone wants to personally meet you. So I'm going to end with one last question, if that's okay. Anne wants to know, what has been the response to your book so far as you've been speaking in groups like tonight?
Oh, that's such a good question. Thank you. That's a nice question, and mostly really positive. I think the people who bother to come out and reserve a ticket or buy a ticket sometimes, depending on the organization, are people who care about the message and are engaged and informed citizens. And in fact, in many ways, it has been really reassuring and inspiring to me to see how many people, and I've been all across the country, which has been wonderful. It's been kind of like a really fun travel of America and seeing Americana, which has been really wonderful. Because I think sometimes, we dismiss the public as being dumbed down and, not caring about politics and self-centered. And I see so many people who have come out and say, thank you for writing this book. I'm really interested in what I can do to help and make this, democracy be restored. So that's been really reassuring. But I will also tell you that there is a dark side. I have received threats, death threats. I get nasty grams. I get things mailed to my home, which is very disturbing. I have children. I get things emailed to me at my law school. I get horrible things said to me and about me on social media. Now, I will say the nice things outnumber the mean things by like 100-to-1 ratio, so that's great. But it's been especially interesting when people use disinformation to attack me about disinformation. That's especially good. There was a day I was on the Rachel Maddow show one night, and then apparently they showed that clip on Fox News. And in response to that, I got a deluge of things. And somebody clearly sent out like what the talking point should be, because everybody there said McQuade favors censorship and wants to repeal the First Amendment, which is absolutely like 100% not true. I am a big advocate of the First Amendment. And so I think that was a form of disinformation, but putting that out there in an effort to discredit me, I don't know who's behind it, if it's the domestic disinformers or the Russian bots or Putin with his KGB pedigree, but one of them. But I take it as a badge of honor that I'm getting through if the disinformers are noticing me. So thank you so much for being here, and I look forward to meeting you in person when we at the reception.